The Lancet study estimating 100,000 probable deaths by October 2004 elicited enough comment in England so that the government had to issue an embarrassing denial. But in the United States, virtual silence prevailed. The occasional oblique reference usually describes it as the controversial report, that as many as 100,000 Iraqis died as a result of the invasion. The figure of 100,000 was the most probable estimate on conservative assumptions. It would be at least as accurate to describe it as the report that as few as 100,000 died. Though the report was released at the height of the U.S. presidential campaign, it appears that neither of the leading candidates was ever publicly questioned about it. The reaction follows the general pattern when massive atrocities are perpetrated by the wrong agent. A striking example is the Indochina Wars. In the only poll, to my knowledge, in which people were asked to estimate the number of Vietnamese deaths, the mean estimate was 100,000, about 5% of the official figure. The actual toll is unknown, and of no more interest than the also unknown toll of casualties of U.S. chemical warfare. The authors of the study comment that it is as if college students in Germany estimated Holocaust deaths at 300,000, in which case we might conclude that there are some problems in Germany, and if Germany ruled the world, some rather more serious problems. Washington's decision to exempt itself from international law, even beyond the ample precedents, has gained the partial support of people regarded as leading advocates of human rights, such as Michael Ignatieff, chairman of the Human Rights Program at Harvard, who supports violations of the Geneva Conventions and indeed of U.S. law on lesser evil grounds that are justified by his personal sentiments. Such grounds are commonly understood to suffice in just war theory. Thus, in his highly praised recent reflections on just war, Michael Walzer describes Afghanistan as a triumph of just war theory, standing alongside Kosovo as a just war. No argument or evidence necessary, which is just as well, since one will search his arguments about war in vain for any non-trivial conclusion that follows from propositions of just war theory or from anything else, unless we add such ubiquitous phrases as, "I think," or "seems to me entirely justified." Campus opponents of what Walzer designates as just U.S. wars are pacifists, he informs us, but pacifism is a bad argument because he thinks violence is sometimes legitimate. We may well agree. I do, but I think is hardly an overwhelming argument in the real-world cases that he discusses. His adversaries on the left are unidentified apart from Edward Said, and more intelligent and circumspect Richard Falk, who give excuses for terror. What the excuses are, we are not told. Walzer's arguments about war are primarily directed against many people on the left, some critics of the war, a lot of talk, leftists, great simplifiers, and so on, all unidentifiable, and routinely Arabs. It is an interesting comment on the prevailing moral intellectual culture that unsupported slander of opponents who are unidentified is considered legitimate practice, particularly among those who modestly describe themselves as the decent left. Indeed, highly meritorious, as long as the conclusions come out the right way. Thief, thief. The expectations of Pentagon planners that they would quickly conquer Iraq and establish a stable client regime were not entirely unrealistic. Had it not been for the extraordinary incompetence of the Pentagon civilians in charge, this should have been one of the easiest military conquests in history, even without the preliminary spikes of activity and other measures to ensure that Iraqi military forces could not or would not resist. The country had been devastated by war and sanctions, and was known to have very limited military capacities and expenditures, even by comparison to the countries nearby. The invasion brought to an end two brutal regimes, and the United States had enormous resources to rebuild the wreckage. Furthermore, any resistance that developed would have only insignificant outside support. Nevertheless, the Pentagon civilians succeeded in creating a substantial armed resistance and massive popular nonviolent resistance, tearing the country to shreds in the process. It is a remarkable fact that Washington planners have had more trouble controlling Iraq than Russia had in its satellites, or Germany in occupied Europe, where the countries were run by domestic governments and security forces for the most part, with the ruling power in the background to sustain the client regimes. There were courageous anti-Nazi partisans, but they could hardly have survived without outside support, and Germany was, of course, at war. Despite all of their unusual advantages, the Pentagon civilians brought about one of the most extraordinary failures in history. Veteran Middle East correspondent Patrick Coburn observed from the scene, quite plausibly. Of the two murderous regimes brought to an end by the invasion of Iraq, only one is allowed to enter discussion: Saddam's tyranny, and even that enters only through a highly selective filter. Saddam was no longer the U.S. favorite he had been up to August 1990, and became again in March 1991, when Bush I authorized the tyrant to crush the Shiite rebellion that might have overthrown him. The outcome of this new phase of Bush-Saddam complicity was tens of thousands of additional corpses. The second murderous regime was the U.S.-UK sanctions, for doctrinal reasons called UN sanctions, though it is common knowledge that the UN administered them under U.S. pressure. But these are off the agenda because they may have caused more deaths than all so-called weapons of mass destruction throughout history. Two hawkish military specialists estimate, surely hundreds of thousands. Summarizing a rich body of evidence, one of the best-informed American correspondents writes that after the terrible years of the UN sanctions, incomes had dropped to 1/5 of pre-war 1990 levels. Infant mortality had doubled, and only a minority of Iraqis had access to clean water. Furthermore, half of all sewage treatment tanks were still inoperable, after having been destroyed along with power supplies by the U.S. and UK bombing in 1991, which unleashed epidemics of typhoid and cholera. Education and literacy collapsed, and growing numbers of Iraqis were reduced to a semi-starvation diet, showing symptoms usually seen only in famines, leading to a tripling of the death rate by 2003, according to UNICEF. The sanctions devastated civilian society, strengthened the tyrant, and compelled the population to rely on him for survival, quite possibly saving him from the fate of other murderous dictators who were supported by the United States and UK up to the last moments of their bloody rule. Nicolae Ceausescu, Suharto, Ferdinand Marcos, Jean-Claude Baby-Doc Duvalier, Chun Du-Huan, and quite a rogues gallery of others, to which new names are being regularly added. For such reasons, the sanctions were bitterly condemned by leading Iraqi opposition figures. Kamil Mahdi wrote that the United States was in effect acting to stain and paralyze all opposition to the present regime, and had given a discredited and moribund regime a new lease of life. The sanctions, he wrote, treat Iraq as a massive refugee camp to be provided with emergency relief. What Iraqis need is to be able to regenerate their economy and resume reconstruction and development. This means that essential services and the infrastructure have to be given a high priority, and the import program has to be geared to raising domestic production, precisely what the U.S.-imposed sanctions regime prevented. That Iraqis might have taken care of their own problems had it not been for the murderous sanctions regime was suggested by the Westerners who knew Iraq best, the respected international diplomats Dennis Halliday and Hans von Sponeck, who administered the UN Oil for Food program in Iraq, and had hundreds of investigators reporting from around the country. Halliday resigned in protest in 1998, condemning the sanctions as genocidal. Von Sponeck resigned 2 years later.